Morning, everyone. My name is Rob Landreau. I'm the Vice President of LINPI. I work as a conservation biologist with the town of Hempstead, and I'm also the Habitat Director for the Friends of Hempstead Plains. Next, we invite our esteemed keynote speaker, Chenae Bullock, to present on Indigenous wisdom, plant medicines, and beyond. Chenae is an enrolled Shinnecock Nation citizen and descendant of the Montauk tribe on Long Island. Chenae is also African American. Chenae is a mogul, pioneer, Indigenous perspective historian, cultural practitioner, and public speaker. Chenae has appeared in Forbes, Rolling Stone, TEDx, South by Southwest, Tribal Business News, Bloomberg, Condé Nast, Traveler, Indian Country Today, and Yahoo Finance. Following her ancestors' footsteps as whalers and business leaders, the foundation of Chenae's work is based on the resurgence of the traditional canoe culture of the Northeast coastal Algonquin communities. Chenae has organized historically sacred paddles in the ancient waterways of the northeastern seaboard. Some of her most recent work has led her to assess for signs of submerged cultural history for the Atlantic Shore's Cultural Core Analysis. Chenae has successfully served as a tribal alternate on behalf of the Shinnecock Nation for the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, which facilitates coordination and collaboration among governmental entities and stakeholders to enhance the vitality of our region's ocean ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Chenae Bullock.
Well, Akwe again. I always bring plant medicines into every conversation because we're talking about plants, right? So it just makes sense. And these are gifts for the organizers. Okay, yes. These are gifts for the organizers. This is sweetgrass. This has been harvested by some women, the Indigenous women in Northeastern region. A lot of times we get together and we harvest and we forage. And so these were gathered and I was gifted these. So I want to gift them to the organizers a little later on. So my talk today is really going to be about the Indigenous wisdom, plant medicines, and beyond, unveiling the resilient Long Island. But let's take a second and think about what resiliency really is. When we think about resilience of Long Island, the resilient Long Island, we think about it in different ways. But I'm here to share my Indigenous perspective. When I think about the resilient Long Island, I think about how resilient the Indigenous people still are. I come from a people known as the Shinnecock people. How many of you all know what that means, Shinnecock? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you do not know what it means. Don't feel shy. Well, the translation, a synagogue, translates to people of the stony shore. The last speaker did an amazing job, and I'm glad I came right behind her to listen about the living shores. So when we think about the living shores, we have to realize that the Shinnecock people are still living on the stony shores of Long Island. That is resilience. You travel the world. How many of you are world travelers? I will be. I never really have time, but I'm here, being resilient on Long Island and in this country. But when you travel the world, you go to all these ancient ruins, right? Shinnecock is not an ancient ruin. It is still an ancient civilization that is still existing and living on the shores of what is now known as Southampton. It's very important that when we think about what I'm going to be talking about, we think about the true resiliency of Long Island, and that is the Indigenous peoples. And that's the wisdom I'm going to be sharing with you all today. So I do like that, resilient Long Island. I'm like, yeah, I'm resilient. I'm from Long Island. I'm a Long Island native. This is very sensitive. Or did you change it? Oh, I was like, so I want to do a little mindful exercise, if that's okay. Because I think it's very important. How many of you all you have plants at home and you spend time with them and you talk to see? I want us to take a moment to, if you want to, close your eyes. And I'm going to reimagine, but I'm going to help you imagine because you may not be able to reimagine something that you've never seen before. I want you to close your eyes and I really want you to think about, try to just tune out all of the noise right now, tune out all of the itches, all of the thoughts, and just be very present in this moment. Think about a time when there were no buildings. Think about a time where the sound was so quiet. The stillness of the air was so quiet. The people were calm, just like the waves. Think about a time where there were no hard homes on the ground. Think about a time where the soles of people's feet connected to the land. Think about all the little tiny birds that felt safe, and the eagles that felt safe, and the whales that felt safe. Think about a gentleness and an elder who spent time walking a path that their elder walked a path. Think about a time where people felt safe to travel from one place to another without having to feel like they had to survive. Thinking about what survival really is at that time. All of the indigenous species of life, from the mycelial network to the two-legged, to the four-legged, to the finned, to the winged. There was an interconnectedness. And I want us to think about reimagining that place called Long Island, the calmness, and the waterways, and the hills and the meadows, the flowers, the birds. And at nighttime, there was no light pollution. You could see almost every constellation in the sky, and you knew that you were connected to all things. There was nothing stopping your connection. When you needed to know something, you were experiencing that wisdom by being a part of the world. Think about that time. And I want you to slowly open your eyes. And I want us to really think about how amazing it is that there are still a people that are trying to practice all of those things. And that is truly, to me, the honoring of that indigenous knowledge. Not necessarily just paying homage, but honoring that. This is a painting many of you all have probably seen. And I just love this painting because when I close my eyes, I think about this, but for me, I remember it. I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm an indigenopathic practitioner in medicine research. And one of the things that's important to think about is the resiliency in the DNA of the plant medicines, as well as the people. So when I'm able to close my eyes, I can reimagine a place. When I open my eyes, I understand what my responsibility is with the instructions of this knowledge. So I want us to be able to honor that. And I think we all do that in our work. Next slide. Okay, wanted to make sure you could see both. So I want to talk a little bit about plant medicines. But first, before we can talk about plant medicines, we have to understand what medicines mean, or what that definition really is to Indigenous people. My consulting firm is Moxitu Consulting. Moxitu in our language means medicine. To us, medicine is not just something for consumption. Just before I got up here and through the day, I'm taking a flower essence. It's a heart mend. because it really helps to calm things down, right? The flower essences, that's a consumption. But medicine is all around. It is the mind, it is the heart, it's the spirit, it's the physical. But the medicine plants are not just medicine to us, they're also medicine to each other. They're medicine to the water, they're medicine to the air, they're medicine to you and I. But then the reciprocity is we are medicine to the plants. It's a full circle. So when we think about medicinal plants or medical plants or plant medicines and all of these different terms that are being, used quite a bit, sometimes it's hard for us as Indigenous people to find that translation because culturally we have a very different understanding and perspective in teachings. So when we think about that as I'm getting ready to talk about tulip poplar, one of my favorite trees. And those healing traditions of that is knowing, one, how to identify them and not getting into a debate whether this is an invasive plant, this is an indigenous plant, this is this kind of species, that's that kind of species, but really understanding what its use is and what our responsibility is to that is the reciprocity. In our language, we have something we say, Wamina Tampawag. Wamina Tampawag means all of my relations. There's no hierarchy within Wamina Tampawag. All of my relations. Tulip poplar is one of those plants that has medicine in various ways. How many of you guys think you can consume tulip poplar? Probably like, how is that a medicine plant, right? Well, it provided a shelter. It provides, not present tense, not past tense. It provides us shelter. This is what we call a witu. We named our homes or name our homes based upon the amount of fires that are inside of it, how many families live in it. So Nashwitu, Nishwitu, so forth, so forth. So if there's 1 fire, 2 fire, 3 fire, this is obviously a 1 fire. And this is covered in tulip poplar bark, which is the most popular tree to use for utilitarian purposes during the time that my ancestors were able to live on the land during that time we just reimagined. And this tulip poplar, the way you actually have to get this tulip poplar is you have to wait till the springtime. And spring is not necessarily just on a calendar. We have indicators in the world that let us know if spring is coming. I've seen some of the presentations a little earlier that were talking about the diseases on these trees, right? And so a time that you might think spring is here, it might be late, it might be early. We're hearing frogs at times that are interesting. So you might not be able to mark it on your calendar and say, okay, I think I'm going to get up and I'm going to go harvest some bark on this date. You have to wait till the sap begins to start running on those trees. Once those sap starts to begin to start running on those trees, those tulip poplar trees, they're so tall, right? Very tall. They don't sprout out a lot of branches and arms, right? They're just straight up perfect for pieces without any interruption or any holes in them at all. So the way that we were able to do that and still do this is that once that sap starts running on the trees, you're able to kind of cut those and scrape them off and peel them off. And then they come out like little pieces. And then you soak them for a couple of weeks. And once you soak them for a few weeks, they're able to be pliable. However, before you cover this bark home, you have to have cedar saplings. And you want cedar saplings, why? Because they're pliable. When they're pliable, you're able to bend them, they don't break. This here is what we call ancient sustainable living. This is a sustainable practice. It has been outlawed in our homelands, off the reservation, to even live in a place like this. But not only that, it's become very difficult, not only for us to access, and I'll get to this later in a different topic, not only for us to be able to access this, but it's become very difficult for us to even obtain any of these things because a lot of these trees, they're no longer living. They're near extinct and endangered. So that's the tulip poplar on the ancient sustainable living practice. One of the ancient sustainable first carbon neutral vessels in the world is the Machoon. This is a photo taken of myself and few of my sister tribes. In this Machoon, we have Mashpee Wampanoag, Scotticoke, Penobscot, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Narragansett, and we also have someone from Columbia right behind me, and myself from Long Island there, Shinnecock, Montauk representing. This canoe's name is Nukamis, or was Nukamis. And I say was because this tulip poplar tree is the first of its kind. It's the first Machoon that has been built in over 400 years at this size. How many of y'all have seen like on your Facebook, like old canoes, they're so finding and all that kind of stuff? I wonder if they're really finding them or if they're looking for them. But it's also important to note that we still have these practices today of sustainable living, as well as living a biocentric lifestyle. Practicing this. Also, the thing about this Machoon is it's got a very flat sort of bottom. We can get very, 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 very close to shore in areas that most vessels cannot. It's extremely heavy, but it's a lot lighter than like pine or any other hardwoods. And the way you do this by burning. And so that is something that's extremely important to understand, that the medicine that we're talking about just from one plant is medicine in so many ways, to the water, to the ecosystems living around it, to the people, right? Because it's a vessel for communication. So for even us today, tulip poplar is that important, because how often have we been able to gather and do something like this as Indigenous peoples? The songs that are shared in that water, how many of you guys have heard water has memory? How many of y'all believe water has memory? Okay, I believe it. Water does have memory. And one of the things that it remembers is the people that have been living in its area for a long time. How is that? Vibration, tone, voice, language, our songs, our dances, all of those kinds of things that when we talk about a resilient Long Island, we have to understand that that is something that the Indigenous people have been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, since we've had water in these areas. Prior to not have water in these areas, we were known as Anishinaabe. How many of y'all have heard of Anishinaabe peoples? Anishinaabe means the families, the original families, all the way from Nova Scotia, Canada, going all the way down into the Carolinas, before there was a Long Island Sound. When we followed the caribou, we were the hunter-gatherers people, you know, and at that time we were called Paleo-Arctic Indians. You've heard of that? Paleo-Arctic Indians equals Anishinaabe. We call ourselves Anishinaabe. The scientists have called us Paleo-Arctic. So that Paleo-Arctic period is when we were living before all that water was there, and all of the people that were in this canoe were of like one community. Once those waters came down, we were able to separate and migrate and be in different areas. But these Machoons are what kept our systems, ecosystems going. So it's extremely important to understand that the people are just as much as a part of the land as the land is a part of us. So we talk about community empowerment. This is in Conscious Point. I've been giving paddle tours in Conscious Point probably since the first year of the pandemic. And it was very important because Southampton History Museum their program director at the time had reached out to me, which was, not something that we really get that often as Indigenous people. I have to say that. And a lot of people work together on trying to restore this, but they reached out to me and they said, we'd love to do some work with you. And they told me that they actually have ownership and possession of Conscious Point, which was a little difficult to wrap my head around, but I had to think to myself to say, okay, well, what is it that I can do here to help at least teach people about Conscious Point, and not just the history of Conscious Point? How many of y'all have known about Conscious Point before? Okay, because I'm over here saying Conscious Point and I'm realizing I got to put that context in there. Conscious Point is the first point of contact to the Indigenous peoples of New York, not just Long Island, but to New York. And in Conscious Point, 8 men from Lynn, Massachusetts were actually going up to Huntington, and they got kicked out of Huntington. This is about 1640. And they ended up in Long Island. I mean, in Conscious Point somehow. They came into Conscious Point, and there's a rock there, just like Plymouth Rock. They came into Conscious Point and they were greeted by Shinnecock people. And that was the first contract handshake deal, if you will, on living together in harmony, as in Wamina Tampawag, because we understood that. And so our responsibility as Shinnecock people is to not only teach people about that first story here in Long Island and New York, but it's also about to teach people about how do we live here in harmony, to have good conscience in how you are with one another. And that's the community empowerment. So we've been leading tours out there in Conscious Point, and right here, there's an area where we can actually get off because the water is very shallow and it's a lot of beautiful shoals. But it's important to talk about community empowerment, not only just the community at large focusing on plants, but beyond that, and true responsibilities that we have as humanity. That culture and preservation, the preservation and knowledge that the Indigenous people still possess and still practice, can actually help with some of the solutions that are trying to be put together when it comes to the sustainability, not only just of Long Island, but of the planetary health. Because we are coming together as Indigenous people to have these conversations, to have these ceremonies, to share these medicines, to gift seeds, to talk about the ancient ways that we were able to do these things. Those kinds of teachings, that ancient wisdom, is still innate in the DNA strands of the people, but also the plants. Many of the talks that we've heard and we know of in native plants are under attack by invasive plants. And that's not something that is foreign to our knowledge, but it's something that I feel like humanity is starting to really understand and begin to care about. And so that's where the preservation of the culture that the people have comes into place. Want to talk a little bit about sustainable agriculture and food sovereignty. How many of you all have read any firsthand accounts from the 1500s or the 1400s? Okay, I did say I'm a historian, so, tough crowd. Hope you guys are getting what I'm saying, you know? And I know that a lot of the things that sometimes Indigenous people come up and we talk about, it's new for some. Some, it's not new. They're just tired of hearing it. Some are not just tired of hearing it. Some don't want to hear it. Some can't understand it. But that's the resilient part of who I am. I have to keep teaching this. I have to keep speaking up about this. I was very taken back by a little bit of that data from Laura about how within 100 years, I believe it's been 1 inch? 1 foot. And in 7 years, 7 to 14 feet, I will not stop teaching this. So I just want to say, when it comes to sustainability, we have the attention now for agriculture. right? We have the attention now. Now I have a voice to be heard. Now we can be heard. Now I can share the wisdom because it's time. And that's what our prophecies are saying. This strawberry right here, right? This strawberry I found in the homelands of one of our shellfishmen. He doesn't like a lot of pictures taken of him. So I was like, all right, fine. I'll make the little cute background with your wampum behind it. We're in his yard, and his yard is full of wampum. I mean, he just allows you to take the shells and put it on the ground, and he wants you to drive over it because now once you drive over it, it cracks into beautiful jewelry, and he goes and makes it. And so I was sitting there learning from him, just an elder teaching me all these things, and I look down, and there's a beautiful little strawberry just out of nowhere, just wild. Because he doesn't mow his land, he doesn't do all that. He just lives on it and gathers from it and spends time and shares songs and dances in it and has medicine conversations like I'm talking about. And I looked down and that strawberry was there. And that strawberry is the first berry of the year. That strawberry is extremely important because that strawberry survived and popped out first. But we also have something called Strawberry Thanksgiving. We have 13 Thanksgivings. I don't have time to get into all 13 of them, but the first one is the Strawberry Thanksgiving, and it is the berry that teaches you forgiveness. It is the berry that teaches you how to make amends. It is the forgiving strawberry. It is the heart berry. It is connected to your heart chakra, you know? So that berry here was so small and it was down there, but there was a law. How many of you all are familiar with the 1665 Duke of York laws? I would suggest you write that down. This is serious. It's important because as we're talking about conservation, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about all these things, and then we're also putting it on the frontliners who are in these municipalities. You got to understand, they're sitting on laws that have not been rescinded. The United States is not that old. So the laws I'm talking about predates the United States. My wisdom predates any and all colonialism here. So this is some ancient information that I'm sharing. So I do take it seriously. I know I got to have a little humor, but I do take it very seriously. Just like when elders get up here and they don't smile because they've been doing this for a really long time and they want to see serious change. But this strawberry right here was so resilient to still live wild without being planted because we harvest it, because it's cared about. That's the reciprocity. And it's used in a good way. The Duke of York's laws, 1665, those laws in there, there's a clause called Indians. And there's about 7 different laws within that. Duke of York's, right out of Richard Nichols, who became the governor at the time of sort of, you know, New York wasn't exactly New York just yet, but then you still had the town of Southampton, which was established in 1640. So, you know, go back 1640. They started bringing the laws down from Plymouth because Plymouth at the time was the, you know, sort of Washington, D.C., Plymouth colony. So you didn't have a court system here, but they still were able to put rules within their township. One of those rules were an Indian could be shot, killed, hung for foraging berries in and around Job's Lane. How many of you all think that that law still exists? How many of you guys are just, you don't want to believe it? These are things that are very important because when we talk about sustainable agriculture, how can you be sustainable if you've removed the people that have been sustaining it? And you've made a law that outlawed us from doing these practices. And now we're trying to figure out how to continue to be sustainable. It's important for us to start putting that into our minds when we're thinking about these solutions because we still hold this wisdom. We were just outlawed for speaking it. So that strawberry is still resilient. That little baby strawberry is still resilient Long Island. Because despite all of the death around getting that strawberry just 2 years ago popped up. So that's something that I wanted to, share about that. But that's also food sovereignty. Because we didn't have to survive. We only lived. We lived. We could go up, know where the strawberries were. We could tell our 9-year-old kids to go all the way down and go grab it and go gather a bunch of them for the feast for the strawberry Thanksgiving, and not feel that something would happen to our children because we knew exactly what that was. But now we have to fight for food sovereignty because of those laws and the laws that have been constantly created. Anyone that has a composting farm or any sort of farms that they're still trying to fight for all these, sustainable practices in this room? It's really hard. And a lot of people are a little afraid to speak up because they see what happens to other people. But at the end of the day, they still survive. The next plant, you guys know what this one is, right? It's one of my favorites. Sassafras. A little frassy. Sassy. Sassafras. My mom always used to say, "You little sassafras." She used to say that. Not so sassy now. But this is like one of my favorite plants because when I go home to Shinnecock, we have a bountiful amount of sassafras trees, not just, saplings and all those kind of things. And I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I have strong relationships with different, environmental organizations around there and Massachusetts and so forth. But when I go home to Shinnecock, we have so much sassafras. But sassafras is also one of those plants that has been outlawed. Do you all know that? Oh, okay. Um, well, during the war on drugs, this plant was put on one of those schedules to be outlawed because of its medicinal purposes. Its medicinal benefits. Look it up, still on there. And so we have to figure out a way not to free some of these plants too, because if these plants have been outlawed, then there might be people that need to just try to go and get rid of them. But then those plants also help some of the other plants grow that we're trying to save. So there's a we can't keep interrupting that Anishinaabe, that all my relations. We have the medicine in us, in all of us, not just Indigenous people, in all of us to do this duty to try to get it back to that sort of, natural ecosystem. And sassafras is one of those plants, just like cannabis. Cannabis is something that you plant. Sassafras is wild. Sassafras has been outlawed for use, specifically when you enter commerce, though. You can give people things, but when you enter into commerce and you begin to sell it, it changes. But it also can be extremely dangerous if you do not know the actual recipe and you do not know, how to use it, and you don't know how much to take and who to give it to. It is very, very dangerous in that. And I do understand why they do need to regulate that, but they can't regulate something that they don't know. Indigenous people hold the instructions, not just the wisdom, the instructions on the proper uses, the when, the where, the what, and the why when it comes to these natural ways. And sassafras is one of them. And that's why it's so beautiful to see how it thrives on Shinnecock, because we still use it. We use a lot of it. So once use something, because think about it. If you live your entire life and you never got a hug, how would you feel? If you were a baby and you came into this world and you just were neglected and you were just talked about and you were regulated and you were put over here and you were stolen and then you were split and all of those kind of things, and that happened generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, that has some serious trauma to the DNA of your strand. Same thing with the peoples, same thing with the plants. But when those plants are used and loved and cared about, then they thrive. And that's what we're beginning to see with a lot of the indigenous plants that are starting to be learned about, cared about and taken care of. And it takes us together, humanity, to do that. There's just a couple of pictures. Myself here with some mullein. This is mullein that's growing on Shinnecock, and we don't really mow in certain areas. We don't mess with certain areas. We just kind of leave it. This is a photo here of myself paddling with a Mashpee Wampanoag sister friend of mine. For a wedding, actually, my cousin's wedding. I was in the bridal shower. You can see my fresh pedicure right there. I purposely took that picture with my foot in there because I had to go to the rehearsal, and I was told, Chenae, you're like the only one that's gonna know where to get all of the stuff for the traditional clam bake. And they came all the way down from Mashpee. They don't know our lands like that. And so I was like, fine, I will get in the canoe with you. I will show you where to get the rockweed and da 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 da. And I was like, and I'm gonna, if you want this to happen, it was the bride. I was like, if you want this to happen, I'm gonna do it. But you better know that I just paid for my pedicure. So, but rockweed and that's right around Shinnecock. But I like this picture because it shows that we still have access to this area. And there's a lot of places that we could get rockweed from, but we don't have access to it. And so what happens to that rockweed? What happens to all that stuff? It just decays. It just, doesn't care. Nobody cares about it. But now it just thrives every year and we know where to get it every time. But then we also rotate where we get it too. My ancestors didn't live in the same place forever. They lived somewhere from 8 to 10 years. And then after those 8 to 10 years, they would burn that entire site and go somewhere else for 8 to 10 years, come back, burn it, boom, 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 boom. You restored the land from fire, the nitrogen that's put back into the soil, all of those kind of things. We had this way of living and respecting, and that was regulated underneath natural law and our traditional protocols too. When the colonists came over here, they enforced all these laws that we unfortunately still have to live under today. So, unless you have a lot of money, you don't just get to move around and do those kind of things like that. But it's important because that photo just shows everything, the pedicure, the access, but that's rockweed on Shinnecock. So the interconnectedness of nature and humanity, I kind of speak like that all the time because it's important. But I'll share something with you all. I was taught by a shellfishman from Shinnecock. He told me that long time ago, there was this Narragansett shellfishman, long time ago, probably like in the, 1800s or 30s. And he would go to this place to go shellfishing, and he would go with 2 buckets. And he would take 2 buckets and he would go to this pond and he would shellfish. And if he picked out a quahog and it was big, he put it in one. Picked out the other quahog, it was small, he put it in the other. He separated the small ones and the big ones. And he did this. And once the buckets were full of small and little, he would take the big ones home. And then what he would do is he would put those small ones back. And then when it was time for him to shellfish again, he would come back, 2 buckets, and he would separate the big ones from the small ones. Have a bucket full of big ones, have a bucket full of small ones. And then he would take those big ones back. And then what he would do that second time is he would take that bucket of small ones, go across to the other side of the pond and put them there. Third time he would come back, he would start to shellfish from that side. Fourth time he would come back, same, technique. He would shellfish from the other side. He gave back at the same time of taking. And we don't really even look at it as taking. It's a gift. I gift you, you gift me. Wamina Tampawag. These are traditional ways of that interconnectedness between humanity and nature. We knew that we had to eat, but we also knew that the earth needed to not be deprived, or else we would never be able to eat. We're almost getting to that point where it is becoming very, very difficult. That's why we have genetically modified foods now, because of the deprivation of those same exact ponds. And when you take that traditional man and his grandson that he's taught and his great grandson that he's taught, and they've been able to do that, and then that practice has stopped in that area, you might not even be able to find one shellfish in there ever again. And that's something to be said about the interconnectedness between nature and humanity, because what happens to the indigenous people has also happened to nature. But I think it's important for people that are studying this to really, really look at the similarities and bring back that wisdom, those people, to do that, because it's something that we all have to be unified on in that story. And I always think about that. Never try to take too much. That's why people say, oh my goodness, you're always giving. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Because sometimes what you've given me isn't necessarily tangible. It's empowering to my spirit. It moves me to do something. And then what I do is because of something you've done. So I have to give back. The extraction and the extraction of knowledge, all of those kind of things has become a very big problem to the mental health of indigenous peoples, so much so, just like you're seeing the diseases in the trees. They're still trying to survive, but it's very difficult. And that's that interconnectedness between the two. Climate change. I think of climate change and I have to think of climate resiliency. I mean, throughout my entire talk, I've been talking about the resiliency of the indigenous plants and the resiliency of the indigenous peoples, right? And I did mention that, in my practice as an indigenopathic practitioner, I do focus a little bit on the epigenetics, not just necessarily the physical environment, but the spiritual aspect of epigenetics. There's been some research done by some of my research partners. And what they have been able to do is take some indigenous plants and go into the lab, right? They've been able to take some of those traditional songs that they were taught. Um, they were able to take even, blood cells from people that have sickle cell disease or certain traits of mental illness. They've been able to take those as well in the petri dishes and sing songs to those particular blood cells, right? We're learning all this through a lot of the different beautiful frequencies and the melodies and the mindfulness and all those kind of things. We're starting to learn the effects of that, the positive impact that that has on stress and anxiety. But when you do that, you really begin to see a resiliency in that gene when they're even planted back into the unfortunate sort of environment that they were, kind of saved or taken out of. And when we think about that, we have to understand that resiliency of the climate and the resiliency of the people, it is the same. So for us, we don't necessarily, I wouldn't say we have to necessarily adapt that particular resiliency DNA strand that has existed in the people. Our ancestors, the ones that unfortunately were stolen, were outlawed, were raped. Those ancestors, the ones that survived, not all of them survived, but the ones that survived were able to pass that same trait down to a generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, specifically through the female, because she holds the umbilical cord. So from umbilical cord to umbilical cord to umbilical cord to umbilical cord to umbilical cord, that recessive trait of the resiliency in that DNA of those people that have been almost genocided and oppressed still exists today, but is still having a difficult time existing in a world that it's almost like doing the same thing. And now we have globalization and westernization. So it's not just happening in a silo, it's happening like all over the place. So you almost can't get away with it, but there's still something within that DNA strand, just like that strawberry, that will still pop up outside of the earth, regardless that strawberry doesn't know that there are laws saying that we can't, that strawberry doesn't know all of that, but they are able to feel the environment. They know what's going on with the air. They know what's going on with the soil. But at the end of the day, they still thrive on that. And so when I think of climate change, everything's always going to change. Humanity is going to evolve. The world's going to evolve because it's living. It's meant to do that. But if we focus a little bit on the resiliency and not just the adaptation, because if we just adapt to it, then we are just no longer even what we were. We've completely changed the DNA of what it once was. The whole genetic code is completely changed. We have to focus on the resiliency part, and that resiliency part is not just in Indigenous people, but it's in humanity. We've always seen people stand up and try to provoke change, positive change, not for complete change and just erasure, but just for the healing aspect so that we can thrive. Because once we can do that, we can unify as a people together and then listen to each other. Here, this is a photo of the World Oceans Day, the Hukalea. How many of y'all have heard of the Hukalea Voyaging Society? Great. I think they're back on the seas this year. But back in 2016 and 2017, the Polynesian Voyaging Society took a voyaging society without a map, and they used traditional, ecological, ancient wisdom to sail all over the world for 2 years in their voyaging canoe. And they came to what was the World Trade Center this day to talk about what is happening with the sea level rise around the world. That is resiliency, because it was illegal to even paddle in certain areas. It was illegal to do all those kind of things. And that's that resiliency. And when you're able to move through all that, you can see the climate change that is happening, but you still have that resiliency to share with the world what's happening. And that's the resiliency there. Education and knowledge. Well, I'm doing a form of that right now, right? I'm educating you all on a lot of the things that, you may not have known, deeper for some of you, first time, not, but the knowledge. But I think it's also important to understand that the humanity, just like the earth, has a spirit. The earth is alive. The earth has a spirit. She has lungs, the Amazons, which most people understand. What happened when the lungs of the earth was on fire? The people really felt that. She has a place where she cleanses herself, where the coral reef is. She has hair, the sweetgrass. All of these things are us as Indigenous people trying to educate. And regardless if we have a cognitive dissonance because some people just believe in science and they're just stuck to science and nothing else, and then some people just resist science, we have to actually remove that and just understand at the end of the day, you have to drink clean water. I have to drink clean water. You have to have healthy food. I have to have healthy food. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what creed. It doesn't matter what gender. It doesn't matter what classification, what status, what tax bracket, what continent, what geographical location. The education and knowledge comes from our ancient prophecies. It comes from our teachings, which has been written in history as myth. It has been written as if it is not true. But we have to unthink that part so that we can become re-educated on something. Because what's also important too is when, I want to go back to this visual. This is a visual of people from around the entire world here. And we are coming together to share and educate one another, because those best practices on how to have better relationships with your local non-tribal governments, how to have stronger partnerships all of those kind of things. There's great examples when we come together and we can learn from each other on that, because we are experiencing firsthand what's happening, because we hold a lot of the tenure on the earth as Indigenous peoples. But it's also important for each and every person that can't necessarily connect to one of these Indigenous tribes to understand, like, long time ago, before the monarchs were established, there were also Indigenous peoples in these areas of Western world. And tap into who you are and what those teachings are when it comes to plant medicines, when it comes to waterways, when it comes to sailing the seas. Because what we're doing is just trying to educate on what we know about the ancient wisdom and the ancient ways of sustainability. And we share it with each other. We want to know from everyone else too what that is. Because once we have that, we have a common place of understanding. And that's sharing. Sharing goes both ways when it comes to ancient teachings. What we have today is we have classifications, we have status. And so there's this, okay, you have this information, we have the money, we have da 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 da. But who are you as a person, as a human, outside of whatever it is? There's a medicine teacher in our community. He says, you know, when people can realize that they're actually nobody, then it doesn't matter what office you sit in. You can interchange. I decided to dress like this today. I could have wore a suit, could have wore my outfit. I didn't do it for reactions. It's just how I felt. But this doesn't necessarily make me this person, because I'm a nobody. And once that happens and we all come together, then we become a people. We become humanity. And once that happens, we can share and educate and not control how you do it, when you do it, why you do it, if you should be doing it or not. Closing your ears, your mind, and your body, and just, you know, all of that, that is no longer sharing. That's extraction. And we have to understand that we are at a place right now where we have no choice but to share and educate with people. It's been very tough for Indigenous people. My brother inspired me to write this book during the pandemic because he said, Chenae, you're always going out and you're doing all these things, and people by the click of a button need to have access to what you're saying. And I had to sit with my teachers because, you know, some of this is very sacred that we should not be sharing because people are not ready for it. You don't hand a child something that's very dangerous and take, go run, because they're not ready. Humanity, we're still trying to figure out if humanity is really ready to get this teachings, to get this ancient knowledge. We're still trying to figure that out. So I'm still trying, okay? But I wrote a book to share some of it, because some of that might help people get back to something that they know. And it's hard because there has been a lot of erasure, not just here in Long Island, but all across the world when it comes to our histories. And those ancient teachings, there was a time where all people lived in this way of biodiversity, from Egypt to Iceland to Asia to here in Long Island. That resiliency still exists in those places, but they're usually very, very silenced, oppressed, and almost eradicated, even today. So if we still are sharing this knowledge, I would advise you to support us too. I would advise you to do that, because once you do that, you have established a relationship of reciprocity. Therefore, we will constantly give because you're giving to and helping you as well, and vice versa. So this is my book here. It's an ebook right now. I am looking for some support in possibly finding a really good publisher. Been approached by a couple, but I really, really want this to be something that people can have on their coffee table and have an experience with. It's a picture book, but it also has some lengthy, oral history on about 50 indigenous plant medicines and oral history and perspective. So feel free to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, as well as grab that QR code that leads you right to the book itself, but it's also access to the website. So you have that. And I also have some little ones that if you don't get it up here when I go to the next slide, you can actually grab the card in the front. And Tabutne in our language means thank you. And with that, I'm just going to, does one of these turn on? I'm gonna end with a small thank you song and some gifts, and I just want to say thank you.
Once Chenae is done, we'll have a few minutes for questions as well.
Right there, thank you. Yep. Tabadne wuche ake kesakuk. Tabadne wuche medikwash kwazikwanash. Tabadne wuche ake kesakuk. Katana tabatne, hey, 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 aho. Thank you for the earth and sky. Thank you for the water and the rocks. Thank you for Great Spirit just for today. Great Spirit, I thank you. Great Spirit, I thank you. Hey, 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 aho. Tabutne. Tabutne. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to gift these sweetgrass to the staff here. That's been really, really helpful. It's not easy bringing probably someone like me to one of your conferences, sometimes because, we have a lot to share, but there's a lot of pain within that. And I just thank you for giving a voice to not just me, but to all of Long Island peoples and sharing this wisdom. And I just want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing for Long Island and the state and the planetary health. And this is just gifts from me to you all. Thank you so much.
Chenae, thank you very much. An inspiring keynote address. We do have a few minutes 2 minutes for questions. So Melody, if anyone.
You said you practice like herbal medicine. Is that what you were saying earlier?
So indigiopathic medicine is actually from a American Indian Practitioners Association. So it's not just like herbal medicine, but it's kind of really, really touching on the healing work that has to happen through wellness. And that is something that is more of like an alternative medicine, if you will, and more of like the functional wellness area.
Do you do that? And you said you live in Georgia. Is that something you do down there, or do you have?
I do it all around the world. I just have a residence in Georgia.
I see. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, one more.
I have one more question, sorry. Can you talk a little bit about mullein? It grows here so much. I see it everywhere. How do you apply it?
Sure. Well, mullein is actually, I don't know if people, know it. And I always say like what I've been taught because I don't want to discount anything anybody else has been taught when I share, certain things. Mullein is like one of those beautiful plants that grows, is very fuzzy, like rabbit's ears, like you were able to kind of see it in that presentation. It grows very, very tall if you allow it to. But I was always taught to actually you forage it from the bottom, not just from the top. You forage it from the bottom and you utilize it and you let it dry out. Once it dries out, you can do it in like really 3 ways. The consumption is tea, obviously. But then there's also steaming. It's really, really good. Breath work is something that I advise people to do if you can spend more time doing it, but also practice breath work with plant medicines as well. It actually really, really helps in those areas of, bacteria that's within your body, specifically mucus, and helps with your respiratory. So steaming with mullein is great, but doing some of those deep smoke it as a consumption as well. It blends well with other medicines. I have a tea on my website, actually. It's Mosquito Box. It has burdock root, mullein, echinacea, and elderberries. On my own, I don't sell it because there's certain medicines you do not sell. Mullein is something that we are okay to do. But I also add what's called osha root, most people know, or bear root. We call it bear root. We add that in there too, because that also helps to, it's like an antiviral, but the mullein really helps with your respiratory. It's helped to save people's lives that have asthma. People specifically around like the COVID, it's really good to do that in practice, but I would never advise people to use medicines all the time just because it doesn't have a flavor or it doesn't taste strong, or be very careful. I never use anything more than 4 to 7 days, depending on what I'm enduring. And sometimes I use those things for the mind too. And not just like, oh, I'm coughing, but mullein is one of those plants. So don't necessarily call every weed a weed. I think there's a question in the back there.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Not so much a question, but as a fellow Indigenous woman, it is so powerful having you in this space to share your knowledge. And I just want to thank you for sharing all of your wisdom here with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for seeing me.
This concludes this session here. We have about a 15-minute break. You can go out and get a drink. We'll be back for the invasive species restoration, I believe, at 11:45. See you all then.